one final question.
You have one over there, I think.
Hi. You're saying that we need to make a major change in language, but also values, I think, and a change that I would certainly support. We just went through a crisis that I think has the color of the issue that you're talking about, the financial crisis I'm talking about of last year and 2 years ago, and a failure of I don't want to call it classical capitalism, but let's just call it a failure of capitalism, and a massively government response, which arguably stanched the damage. I find it dispiriting, and I'm curious to know if you do, that we just went through a crisis of failure of capitalism, successful government response, and yet the dialogue hasn't changed, the underlying feeling of it hasn't changed, and you're talking about having to make that kind of change, and we know our chief of staff just said you never waste a good crisis. I feel like where's the change going to come from if we've just had this kind of crisis and there hasn't been any even the shadow of it?
Okay, thank you. I don't agree. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. I don't agree that we went through the crisis of capitalism. As the Italians say, magari, I wish. We went through a very distinctive crisis of unregulated financial markets, and it was solved in a rather dispiriting way by the state entering in as the supporter of last resort to the practitioners of those momentarily failed markets. What is wrong is our failure to be more, I guess angry is the right word, that we are, that we should live in a situation like this and have no response to it. And this is not a uniquely American problem. The socialists of Europe, social democrats of Germany, the left in Italy, the left in France, God help us, have no response to this crisis. Partly this is, in a way, structurally, for the same reason that they had no response to the 1931 crisis either, which also ushered in a series of conservative or right-wing governments on the back of a major economic collapse. The left doesn't know what to do with unsuccessful capitalism, because the story of the left, of course, historically, was that capitalism keeps on succeeding until it finally fails once and for all. Till it fails once and for all, they didn't have much to say on the subject. It hasn't failed once and for all. What has failed is our ability, our capacity to articulate an alternative governmental response to a distinctive partial failure of the financial system. You can't blame the bankers, as it were, for this. And I don't just say that because I see some in this room that don't wish to cause offense. This is a failure on our own part. We don't know how to talk ethically about politics. We don't know how to say that something is wrong. We don't know how to say that something is unjust. We know how to say it's unfair, but only with respect to our personal situation vis-à-vis a given crisis, a given action, a given consequence. I think that I find it very sad that the present administration, in which so many hopes were vested, not least by the younger generation in this room, should have found so little fierceness, so little urgency in now, that it has nothing to offer by way of a response, except to invite the same crisis to happen in a few years' time. We need to go much beyond the present language that we use. For example, we talk blindly of globalization. Globalization as either causing or curing a given set of economic tensions, difficulties. We look at India or China. We don't look very closely. Take India. Approximately 1 billion people, about 400 million people estimated to be in paid work. 1.3 million of that 400 million work in the so-called new economy, or any aspect of the globalized economy. The remaining 398 million still work in the pre-globalized world. Much of the world does not live or work in the imagined economic universe that we rhetorically inhabit when we talk about our world today. We need to ask very different kinds of questions about the choices and the politics that we opt for. One last point on that. We assume very readily that globalization is a given. We must adapt. Like it or not, good or bad, but we must adapt. Globalization, arguably, will have, predictably, perhaps it already is having, a very unglobalizing response politically. The globalization before 1914 produced the reversion politically to states, protectionism, authoritarian responses to outside threats, authoritarian protection against external insecurity, political responses to economic crisis. We shall probably, in the next decade, 2 decades, see the same thing, with the state as the intermediate institution, responding, acting, protecting well or badly, not clear, to the threats that globalization is perceived as posing to voting populations in individual countries. This may be an internationalized economy, but we vote politically, make political choices, still within individual states. So it's at the level of the state that we should be looking to see what sort of policies we practice, what sort of political language we favor, what sort of regulations we are willing to see. I don't think the issue of whether or not capitalism is going to collapse is on the table, but whether the state is up to the challenge of responding to the inadequacies of capitalism, that very much is on the table. It's been on the table on and off since 1914. What I think we don't realize is that it's back on the table in a more serious and significant way for the first time in 80 years. Okay.
We'll do you. You've been waiting patiently. This will be the last question. I'll ask you to be brief.
Patience is rewarded. My name is Joanne Landy, and I guess I just want to both appreciate what you say about how coarsened our society has become just in the last 30 years. I mean, when I was growing up, you didn't have homeless people, except for people who were mentally ill, but you didn't have people who were homeless like you see in today's paper because their house was foreclosed. This is now, and really since the age of Reagan, acceptable. And this acceptability, I think, is what you're challenging. At the same time, though, I don't think that the justice, equality, and what was the other one? Fairness that you hope to achieve, especially on a global basis, is really possible without challenging capitalism. I think that what we have now are corporate actors who are wreaking exactly the havoc that you describe on global populations and on us, and that unless we find ways to replace their rule with democratic rule, I think we're lost. You're right that we have to remember the Gulag. And I think that's the first thing we have to say, is that we reject Stalin, Stalinism, and all of that, despite what the first speaker said. But I think what we need to do is find democratic ways to run ourselves locally and globally.
Thank you. Tony?
Well, motherhood and apple pie. I couldn't agree more. But I'm reminded of something in Beatrice Webb's memoirs. Beatrice Webb, the sanctimonious, self-important, self-sufficient, talented, gifted, pedantic, co-founder of the Fabian movement, and one of the early British democratic socialists. She used to go down to the East End of London, and she reported there in the 1890s, meeting people who she politely avoids describing as Jewish revolutionaries, but who were the socialists of the East End of London, rather like the socialists of the East End, the Lower East Side of Manhattan 10, 20 years afterwards. And she said that her conversations with these gentlemen, all named Insky and Shmuel and so on, was enlightening, mystifying at the same time. Enlightening because these guys had a radical, uncompromising, absolutely non-negotiable view that capitalism was the problem, socialism the solution, that anything in between was moral, political compromise, economic ignorance, and cultural abandonment. And she would come away exhilarated as she went back to the West End, to her nice upper-middle-class Christian life. And then she would ask herself, over drinks with her even more boring, sanctimonious, self-important, boring husband, Sidney, she would ask herself, that's fine, but how do we get there? And she spent the rest of her life trying to work out how you get there. That our task is not to say that capitalism is the problem. That's dead easy. It's not to point out that rapacious corporations, overpaid investment bankers, are trashing much of what we built up over the last 100 years. That's easy too. It's also largely true. The question is, how do you get there? That's the hard one. You get there by those kind of conversations that the young gentleman who asked the first question was alluding to. You take socialism off the table. Not because it's bad, but, it's like talking about your ex-wife. Sure, she was bad. But the present is the present. You don't have to worry about her. You're into the next one. Okay?
So this was an evening that everybody expected it to be full of Tony's intelligence, his deep historical knowledge, and his courage. Tony Judt, thank you for being Tony Judt. Thank you.